I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub. And in the news, a landmark verdict handed down last year against the PLO and Palestinian Authority was reversed 2 weeks ago by a federal appeals court in Manhattan. The multi-million-dollar verdict was issued in February of 2015. It found that the PLO and PA were liable in terror attacks that took place in Israel between 2002 and 2004. The lawsuit was brought on behalf of American victims and families of American victims killed or wounded in those attacks. The PLO and PA were found to be liable for over $200 million, which was then tripled under the U.S. Antiterrorism Act to $655.5 million. The Antiterrorism Act allows American victims of international terrorism to sue in U.S. courts. However, in a 3-0 vote on August the 31st of this year, the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Manhattan threw out the 2015 ruling. They said that a lower court judge had been mistaken in concluding he had jurisdiction over the case, and the appeals court ordered that the lawsuit be dismissed. Attorney Kent Yalowitz led the trial team in that landmark lawsuit against the PLO and PA and represents those victims and families of victims of terror. Kent Yalowitz joins us now on our phones. Kent, thank you so much for coming on JBS today.
Glad to be with you, Teisha.
Now, before we get to the recent appeals ruling, I'm hoping you can give our viewers some background. How many years have you been involved with this case?
Sure. The case has been going on since 2004, and when it got close to trial, I came in about 2013.
And can you talk a bit about who these plaintiffs in the lawsuit are? Tell us about them. Some of them were themselves wounded in those terror attacks, and some have sued on behalf of their loved ones. Who are these people?
So our families are ordinary Americans who were going about their daily lives when evil struck them. Alan Bauer was walking home from work with his 7-year-old little boy up a pedestrian street. Janice Coulter was on a two-day business trip, eating lunch in a university cafeteria. These were just regular people like you and me.
And when you and the families of those people or those who were injured received that initial ruling in February of last year, that landmark verdict, what was that moment like for you and for them?
Well, I think that they were very gratified, and I think they were very proud that they had stood up against terror. It was very difficult for a lot of the families to come to New York and testify and tell their stories, their emotional and difficult stories, and I was gratified that the jury understood the evil that had gone on, and I think that our families were proud of what they had done.
So that was in February of 2015. And then 2 weeks ago, the ruling from the appeals court. Here's a portion of the ruling written by one of the judges on the panel, John Coltons. He wrote as follows: "The federal courts cannot exercise jurisdiction in a civil case beyond the limits prescribed by the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, no matter how horrendous the underlying attacks or morally compelling the plaintiff's claims." He said the attacks had not been specifically aimed at Americans, and therefore there was no jurisdiction. So first of all, can you explain the appeals court ruling and the logic used in it?
Sure. Actually, I understood the Second Circuit ruling to be that unless the attacks took place on U.S. soil or the attackers did something in the United States, within the territory of the United States, the Second Circuit would decline jurisdiction. And my view, and I think the better view, and the one that I hope that the full court or perhaps the Supreme Court will adopt, is that if you kill American citizens for the purpose of influencing U.S. foreign policy, and if you do that by giving material support and resources, as the PA and the PLO did, to U.S.-designated terror organizations, you have directed your activities toward the United States. Anytime that terrorists abroad threaten the safety of Americans or the interests of American citizens, it seems to me that is targeting the United States. And another thing that is really quite shocking about this decision is that the statute was originally passed in 1992 exactly with the PLO in mind. If you go back to the legislative record of this statute, Congress was trying to provide a remedy for Americans killed overseas by terrorists or injured overseas by terrorists, and the exact case that they had in mind was the Klinghoffer case, in which an American citizen, Leon Klinghoffer, was indiscriminately killed by the PLO, and his family held them to justice in New York. Congress modeled that and wanted to broaden that remedy.
So the Antiterrorism Act that you're referring to, passed in 1992, does it specify anywhere that the attacks have to be directed specifically at Americans? And wasn't it created, as you said, to protect Americans overseas? It seems like there's some difficulty in relating that to the ruling made by the appeals court.
Right. The statute protects Americans wherever in the world they travel. If you're an American citizen, or if you are married to or the child of an American citizen or the parent of an American citizen who's killed outside the United States or injured outside the United States, you have the protection of this law according to Congress and the President. And as I said, the appeals court ruling is attempting to pare back on the power of Congress and the President to create protections like this. It's a very judicially muscular opinion.
So what was your initial response when you heard the appeals court ruling? Were you completely shocked? Did you think that, it was not so surprising? What were your feelings?
We were very surprised and very disappointed. We expected a more sophisticated hearing from the Second Circuit than we got. Although the decision is very lengthy, it's incredibly narrow-minded and quite frankly misapplies the law.
I'm going to read something you were quoted saying when, in response to that ruling, you said, "The very terrorists who prompted the law," referring to the U.S. Antiterrorism Act, "have now hidden behind the U.S. Constitution to avoid responsibility for their crimes." Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure. As I said, the very case that led to this statute was the murder of Leon Klinghoffer by the PLO. And it's quite amazing that all these years later, the PLO itself is wrapping itself in the U.S. Constitution to say that they should be protected. And it's one of the great ironies of the case.
Now, just to clarify, the lawsuit refers to 6 specific terror attacks that took place in Israel from 2002 to 2004 during the Second Intifada, which was a large wave of terror by Hamas. One of those attacks, which you mentioned one of the victims in your earlier remarks, took place on July the 31st of 2002, when a Hamas-affiliated terrorist left a bag containing a bomb in the cafeteria of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, killing 9 Jewish students, 4 of whom were Israeli, 4 of whom were American, 1 of whom was a dual French-American citizen. I know the families of those victims have testified in the lawsuit. What is it like, Kent, to, in essence, be partnered with these families who are seeking some form of justice for their loved ones?
Well, for me, it was really a privilege to stand up and give voice to people who essentially had no voice. I'm very proud of the work that we did, and certainly I had a role, but many people contributed to that effort, and in the end, it was really about the families and their courage to stand up to terror.
Here is more of what Judge John Coltons wrote in the ruling for the panel. He said, "The attacks in Israel had not been, quote, expressly aimed at the United States." He said they were, quote, "random and fortuitous in nature and that evidence at trial showed that the shooters fired indiscriminately and chose sites for their suicide bomb attacks that were full of people because they sought to kill as many people as possible. Now, again, the suit was brought under the U.S. Antiterrorism Act, which, as you said, specifically allows U.S. citizens who are victims of international terror to sue. So you're saying that the law doesn't specify that the victims have to have been targeted because they are American?
That's right. The law does not have to specify that. The only conditions are that the conduct of the defendant has to have been what the statute calls international terrorism, which is actions that are violent or dangerous to human life and that injure the plaintiff and that appear to be motivated by an intention to influence government policy or civilian population by coercion or intimidation. So here, that was very obvious that the attacks were part of a broader campaign that was indeed designed to influence U.S. government policy, Israeli government policy, and the civilian populations involved. And you have to remember too that there are hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens in Israel, many of whom are in the large metropolitan areas like Jerusalem. And so when you send a suicide bomber into a place like that, you're just bound to hit not only Israelis but people from all over the world, and certainly Americans. By the time of these attacks, many Americans have been killed in terror attacks, and there's no question that the PA and the PLO knew that if they continued the kind of terror attacks that they had been engaged in, that they would injure and kill American citizens, and indeed they did.
So, Kent, the question is, what now? With the ruling by the Court of Appeals at the end of last month, where does that leave the case brought by the families? What legal options do you have? I mean, it seems from what you just said about the Antiterrorism Act that there's a very clear answer as far as what that act is supposed to include, and that the ruling seems to be incorrect in saying that it does not include that situation. So what is your next step?
We have asked the full court to hear the case, the full Second Circuit to hear the case. And we'll see what they say. And if they don't hear the full case, we have the option of asking the Supreme Court to hear the full case, and we'll see how they respond. Those are our in-court options at this time.
How did the families respond when the appeals court released their ruling?
Well, the families that I represent believe in justice, and they believe that right makes might, and they're hopeful that we're going to get this turned around, and that after all these years, they're going to see not just public unmasking of the PLO and PA terror machine, but that they'll actually receive some compensation for their injuries.
And not only was the verdict amount huge, but it is also very significant that the initial verdict held the PLO and PA liable for their roles in financially supporting those terror attacks that took place in Israel. And as you said back in February of 2015, money is oxygen for terror. Terrorists cannot function or act without financial support. So can you speak to the significance of that ruling of liability, and does the reversal by the appeals court deal with that issue of liability at all?
Sure. So let's take those one at a time. The appeals court did not in any way touch the conclusions of the jury that the PA and the PLO were guilty of engaging in acts of international terrorism, and the jury's verdict was, unanimous, and it was 100% liable on every single count, which included not just the financial assistance to terror groups, but it also included the provision of personnel to terror groups, and not just Hamas, but also the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. It included harboring terrorists. It included providing weapons to terrorists. And ultimately, it included rewarding their own employees to the point where the jury concluded that PA security officers who were in the PA security system, who engaged in terror, were acting within the scope of their employment in killing and injuring civilians.
So, as far as the liability, you're saying that was not touched. The appeal only dealt with the amount of compensation?
Correct. No, not the amount of compensation, but the raw power of the court to hold somebody accountable in a court of law for killing and wounding Americans for the purpose of influencing U.S. foreign policy. And the court said that is not enough, and so they threw the verdict out, not based on a lack of evidence, not based on any conclusion that the PA and PLO were not guilty. In fact, they acknowledged that the crimes were heinous and morally reprehensible, and yet they said that the United States is powerless to hold the PA and PLO accountable in these circumstances.
So
it's really a shocking and disappointing outcome.
So is that what Judge Colton refers to as far as jurisdiction?
Correct. That's right.
Can you talk a bit, Kent? You spoke about this briefly at the beginning of our conversation. I know you've tried many cases. I'm wondering if this case was different for you, what the impact was it on a personal level for you to be involved in this case over the last several years?
Sure. In many ways, it was a very difficult and challenging case. The emotional weight of helping these families was very heavy, and I think all of the lawyers involved in the case felt that weight. Felt the weight of the victims, felt the weight of the survivors, felt the weight of the evil that was perpetrated, and we were looking at cases where people in the Palestinian security forces sent children to their deaths. One of our cases, the suicide bomber was a 17-year-old boy, and who does that? Who sends a 17-year-old boy to blow himself up on a bus, and then rewards the people who did it, rewards the people who sent him? They sit in jail, they confess to their crimes. They said, I only wish I killed more Jews. And these people get paid and promoted and glorified by the supposedly peace-loving Palestinian Authority. These are the moderates with whom our country is dealing.
Are there any repercussions, as far as you see it, for the Antiterrorism Act because of this appeals court ruling?
Well, I think it substantially injures the power of Congress to use remedies like this, and I think it renders the ATA effectively a dead letter. At least in the primary conduct that it was aimed to address.
And obviously, the significance, or perhaps the silver lining, in the fact that there was this appeals court ruling and that this case will now continue to be in the headlines for however long your next efforts take, is that it keeps the focus on that, unfortunately, terror attacks are continuing in Israel. This is not a story that has ended. This is a continuing issue. And as you said, the Antiterrorism Act remains an important law that, unfortunately, will continue to be used. So is that at all in the background of your mind that it's an opportunity almost to once again bring focus to these attacks and to how Americans should be protected by this law?
Yeah, I think that look, people criticize the tort law as being a blunt instrument, and I understand the reasons why they might think that, but I don't think they're right about that. I think that a law like the Anti-Terror Act serves a very, very important purpose, which is that it doesn't cost very much for the Palestinian Authority and the PLO to perpetrate a terror attack, and it costs the price of a bottle of homemade explosives and a bag of screws from a hardware store, and the costs that they impose on society as a result are enormous. And part of the idea of civil law is to concentrate those costs at the place where they can best be avoided. And so today, when the PA and the PLO pay terrorists who sit in jail for their crimes as a reward, they are making a policy choice that is encouraging and inciting terror. And if they are hit where it hurts them in their pocketbooks, they will change their policies. And so if we in this country are looking for some way of making sure that our tax dollars of aid to people in the Middle East in general and to the Palestinians in particular are used for good rather than for evil, then this law plays a very important role. And it's really a terrible shame that our courts have not upheld it as written.
Well, Kent, we certainly hope that for only the best results in the future efforts you and the families take in this important case. We thank you for your time and your efforts, and to the families as well for their courage. And I hope we get a chance to speak to you again soon.
Me too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Kent Yalowitz is a partner at Arnold Porter in New York City. He led the trial team in the landmark lawsuit brought by American victims of terror in Israel against the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, the landmark verdict that was reversed just 2 weeks ago. Thank you to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, editor, Dennis Golan, and JBS's associate producer, Dara Golub. I'm Teisha Bader, in for Mark Golub.